Good afternoon. Oh, come on, you can do better than that. Good afternoon. Thank you. I realize I'm the only thing between you and lunch. Oh, I'm one of two things between you and lunch. So I will try to be brief. My name is Michelle Martinez, and who am I? Why am I up here? I don't know some days. I come from a family that is 5 generations deep in living in Southwest Detroit. And we moved to the region here in Detroit because we were looking for jobs in the automotive industry. And this is the story of a lot of Detroit families, right? You know, and we came to Detroit, my great-grandfather didn't get a job in the factory, but he could shine shoes outside of the factory. And that's a lot of the story of how we understand both our relationship to industry, because industry is not new to us, right? Actually, our becoming of neighborhoods and around factories was a part of why we were here. But it also tells a small story about race and racism in Detroit, which is that we don't always have equal access to the same things. And over the decades, we haven't had equal access to housing. And so a lot of our neighborhoods ended up being very close to the factories, but the neighborhoods were clean air, sweet air, delicious, wonderful summer air. Those were the neighborhoods that were redlined, right? So we have to understand why air pollution really is in our neighborhoods. My grandfather owned a small store, and he sold canned goods that were turned over from World War II to the Mexican community. So we were eating sort of the expired food from Europe that came back over here. And a semi-truck ran over a 2-year-old. And in proximity to the bridge, it was very common to have trucks running through Mexican town. So he advocated to get a sign put up to divert trucks from some of the residential neighborhoods. And that was in the 50s. We're still having the same conversation in 2018, right? And so this is kind of why I'm here, right? Because the stories that we all share together and the stories that we hold as a community are all interlock between the air we breathe, you know, the homes that we own, the stories of our elders and our ancestors, and the narrative that we have to change if our young ones are not going to tell exactly the same story again in 1, 2, 3 generations. So part of what we do in Michigan Environmental Justice Coalition, and I'm the coordinator for the state, is talk about how we can change the narrative around environmental racism, around environmental justice, because we know a few things. It disproportionately impacts people of color and poor communities, and that's true in Michigan, and that's true all over the country. And it's not only been true since the sort of birth of the environmental justice movement in Warren County, North Carolina, where they were dumping toxic contamination in a Black community, but it's actually gotten worse over 25 years. So we say pretty explicitly that this is a case of environmental racism. We also say pretty explicitly that we know that it impacts our health. We know that when the EPA or the National Institute for Health conducts research, they assess the risk of industrialization and the pollution that comes from it. And they say, okay, well, what's the risk if we put this much pollution in a neighborhood? And the risk can be 1 in a million, 8 in a million, 10 in a million, and they set the acceptable amount of pollution for our country to have industry. And that pollution impacts us the most. We carry the greatest risk in Southwest Detroit, along with other communities like South Texas and the Bayou, where there's a lot of oil refineries, right? In LA, where the ports are, they accept the risk, right, of what it takes for us to get clothes and toys and those things. And so we have to also understand that in our economy, there are sacrifice zones. And so part of our society is sacrifice towards this economy. The other thing that we need to say is that we must demand change. And change is structural and it's institutional, right? So the MDEQ implements the law. And we say the Clean Air Act says that we should be protected against toxic contamination. And the MDEQ says we follow the letter of the law, regardless of where you live, regardless of your race, and regardless of your income, because everybody deserves equal protection under the law. And that's true. We need to continue that practice. But we also need to include in that equation the risk relative to the concentration of industry and how it impacts our quality of life. So that's what we really want to tell the MDEQ, and we continue to try to look at the different ways that we can enter into the conversation to change the law, change the institutions, and change the ways that people really say, you know what, that just has to happen, and if you don't like it, you need to move. And that's where the conversation's at. What's new in 2018 is not that we have a different relationship to industry. We still need jobs, right? But we have a responsibility now to say we can make a new economy. We can make a clean energy economy, right? We also have new research. So the Clean Air Act was written in the 70s. The research around health and the risk of toxic pollution in neighborhoods, the research has grown so much. We have new information, and so the law needs to change and adapt relative to the new things that we've learned over the past decades. So we're looking for ways. Now, the ways that we make change would be at the federal government with the EPA, and if you know Scott Pruitt, you know that probably not a lot of things are going to happen for our community. If you watch Snyder and you've seen the actions around environmental justice communities and the tragedy that's happened in Flint, we don't have a lot of options for compassion from that decision-making target. So our onus is now to come up with new ideas and new ways to change the narrative and change the dialogue in this new era where we must demand a new economy. So how do we do that? I think the most humbling moment is to say, I don't know, right? Because I'm just one person. And that's why we have these summits. So this year we're going to have a summit, and we're inviting all of the EJ communities around the state to say, we've tried everything. If we put all of our brains together, what's next, right? And so you can come to Flint and talk to other EJ communities. You can present a session. If you go to our website and go to the Summit 2018, there's a page that calls for proposal. You can propose a session. I have an idea, right? I want to change the narrative. I know somebody. I want to work with Flint folks or Muskegon folks or Benton Harbor folks on a session. And let's work together to try to make change. So that's it.
Is there a quick question about that? We'll take one. Yes. Wait for the mic.
Yeah, I noticed nobody ever mentioned about these airplanes putting chemtrails up in the air. I want to know, what is that all about? If they're putting mercury and aluminum in the air, which that affects everybody.
I hear a lot about this, and mostly from folks who come to me. My only response to that ever is, I know that there are smokestacks, and I have their addresses, and I know what's coming out of them, and I have a database, and I can't even solve that, right? And so let me solve that first, and then I'll think about the airplane, right? I'm not saying that it's not a problem, but for me, from where my vantage point is, like the most pressing problem is right across the street.
So, first I'd like to say I'm relatively new to the area, and having learned some of the history, it's pretty heartbreaking to see what's happened and what continues to happen. And so it feels like to break out of it, we kind of got to stop the source, right? And it's right down there, pretty much, and I can smell it at my house. And I know that in other areas of Detroit, like with the incinerator over in kind of the North End area, they have a number they can call, and the incinerator gets a fine, you know? And so that's like something you can do. And so what about when we smell, you know, stuff coming from all the industrial plants up that way? Is there something that we can do immediately and that will have an effect? And then eventually, you know, how do we shut down all those plants up there that are, you know, causing our community so much harm?
Yeah, that's a big question, and it's a big conversation. And the first thing is the number is the same number. So you just call that number. The reason why it's effective with the incinerator is because there's a group of about 40 activists who follow up with MDEQ every time a call is made, and then periodically have a session with them and call them to the carpet and say, why aren't you responding to this? And then after they do that, they're holding a press conference at noon. He can come up. He can come up. So it's about that social power. And 48217 residents have been meeting with Marathon, you know, and it's constantly having that social pressure to match what is complaints, permit violations. Say hi. How old are you? Mad. So yeah, and the permit violations have to be relative, right? They get like a $130,000 ticket, right? And they probably make that in a few minutes. So how that impacts a company also changes, but they're also working on the solution, right? Recycling and the citywide was directly a product of their advocacy, you know, working with cities like Warren or Grosse Pointe, who ship their trash to Detroit and burn it in our neighborhoods, and advocating with residents there to increase their recycling, other things like that. So that's the power of people, right? Yeah. Thank you.
Yeah, I would like to, again, some recommendations on things to do. You know, in terms of your legislators, kind of insist on a position of health in all policies type approach, so that they begin to clarify risks, particularly health risks and certain things that are happening. And I would also suggest and really make a plea that whenever you see good behavior in a legislator, which can happen, that you write them a letter to thank them for that. It goes a long way to encourage certain behaviors, which may spill over into their colleagues as well. And the other thing that I will say is, as you begin to become aware of the fumes, dust, and chemicals that you may be exposed to, also make sure that you discuss those exposures with your medical provider, because they need to be more aware about the relationship between the environment and your health, and oftentimes they won't pay attention to that unless you bring their attention to it. And it's another way to get another advocacy group involved in environmental health change, okay? So with that, we're going to go to our last presenters.